now look at some other forms of employment in the 19th century world, and it absolutely goes without saying that the people in the 19th century worked much longer and much harder than what we can even imagine today. Everything was done by hand, so all the construction works, including the construction of railways and roads and tunnels and basically everything, was done by hand and using, especially in the in the first half of the 19th century, very simple equipment, traditional equipment. Agricultural employment was still relatively numerous, and much of the work on the land was done by hand. If you haven't seen the documentary or kind of reconstruction series by the BBC called The Victorian Farm, it's a good idea to watch it. But the general opinion nowadays about work in the Victorian period is that of shock. It's shocking for the modern audience, it's shocking for the modern reader or viewer, especially the grinding hours that people had to work, and first and foremost, of course, the child labor. What we need to remember is that the Victorians did not invent child labor, or any form of labor for that matter, and they were the first generation to really try to do something against the most harsh aspects of child labor and general labor. So we have the beginning of the laws, the factory laws regulating the working conditions of the workers, including women and children. We have the beginning of trade unions. We have the beginning of giving the workers the voice. Actually, quite a surprising number of testimonies survives from the from the workers themselves, including children. And another thing to perhaps recommend to you is a documentary I found on YouTube entitled Private Life of the Industrial Revolution. I guess the alternative title is The Real Mill. A mill was a popular name for a factory, especially textile factory. And it's based on mostly on real life accounts of the workers from one such mill called Quarry Bank Mill, and the place itself survives. It's quite picturesque. So if you want to see it, so it's a two-part documentary narrated by Tony Robinson, the actor who became quite famous as a presenter of such programs. We'll talk about another one in a moment. He's a kind of BBC specialist in working people's history. So if you want to know anything about the lives of ordinary people in history, Tony Robinson, or Sir Tony Robinson now, is your man. The documentary came as an addition to a Channel 4 mini-series called The Mill. It's a kind of feature mini-series, also based on those testimonies of usually young people. Many of them were orphans, and they worked as so-called apprentices, so they were basically typical child labor workers in the cotton mill. So what we can learn from this documentary is that basically, of course, the living conditions were very harsh, and work was very hard in the Victorian period, but gradually, as the century progressed, it was getting better. Working people got the right to speak up. They started to organize themselves in trade unions. They were fighting for the vote, and actually they were getting it. It's not only the women, it's also the working men who wanted more representation and the right to vote. Because before that, the necessary thing to be able to vote was to have the so-called property qualification. So you needed a certain amount of income to be able to vote at all. So it wasn't only women who were excluded from the voting system. This changes in the 19th century. Also, the first strikes of the workers happened in the 19th century. So, of course, it was the time of child labor and hardship and strict discipline, but it's not the whole picture. So another thing which is quite typical for the 19th century industrial work is the so-called paternalist system that many of the mill owners or factory owners used. It means that the owner of the factory tried to provide some living conditions, in many cases decent living conditions for the workers. So in the case of Quarrybank Mill, the owners, the family called the Greggs, and especially the main owner in this period called Samuel Gregg, built not only the factory buildings themselves, but also the entire workers' village with the accommodation for the workers. Of course, part of it was pure calculation, so that the workers wouldn't have to spend a lot of time getting to work and back, so they could perhaps work longer, and also that they would use the amenities provided by the factory owner, including a school, including a shop, where they would be basically spending the money, most of the money they earned at the factory, back for the factory owner, buying the goods he provided. Of course, he was a monopolist, so he could provide any kind of quality of at any kind of price that he wanted. Many of those early industrialists were very religious people. Especially they were non-Anglican Protestants, so the so-called dissenters, because for at least half of the century the dissenters were prohibited from joining some of the prestigious professions, like becoming a parliament member, becoming a doctor or a lawyer. So if they were entrepreneurial, they very often engaged into business activities, and some became very successful businessmen. So what they represented were a lot of those Victorian values we talked about, of modesty, hard work, self-improvement. This extended also to their wish to improve the workers. Of course, the purpose of these workers, and those workers' villages very often included a school for the children, especially if they used child labor. The first factory acts of the 1830s proclaimed that each child had a right to 2 hours education a day, provided by the employer. So there was a schoolroom attached to the factory buildings, and the children were learning some basic literacy, of course, but at least they were getting something. There was also a chapel, so the religious observance of the workers was also monitored or controlled by the factory owner. So of course the purpose of it was to spread the Victorian values, spread the middle class values through the control and the kind of monitoring of the behavior of the workers to make them better workers. Not all the factory owners were honest. They would try to trick the workers into working longer hours. For example, the 19th century is the time when people start to live by the clock. They are not really working or living according to the times of the day or to the seasons. Everything is dictated by the clock. And most factories had a big clock visible to the workers. Of course, some owners of the factories tampered with the clock. So, for example, made it run a bit quicker at night and slower during the working hours, so they could trick the workers to actually do more work than they agreed for. But anyway, punishments were frequent. In case of children, this might be physical punishment by beating or locking up the unruly children in I don't know, a closed room for a day or something. But very often, and for adults, these were fines. So the subtractions from their meager wages for any misbehavior or, I don't know, accidental damage of the goods or whatever. So this is a complex situation. I strongly encourage you to watch the Private Life of the Industrial Revolution and also the Mill series. It's very interesting. And especially it's a true story, so this is quite a good thing to watch. So the problem probably why the working conditions were so bad was that the regulation came quite late and the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. So the new forces of industrialization and urbanization in places like Manchester, for example, with a mass migration of people from the country looking for any employment and accepting very bad working conditions or living conditions, living in cramped circumstances, with very poor hygiene and high levels of disease. This was really proving that the system was not meant for this massive explosion of the industry and the city life. So something we already mentioned, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the German intellectuals, philosophers, they worked in England, they wrote in England. Whatever they wrote against the capitalist system, they wrote it after observing at very close distance, especially Engels, whose father owned a mill, the hard life of the workers in England. So there was the Chartist movement in the 40s demanding the reform. The parliament rejected it, but it didn't really stop the movement of the workers. There was a general strike for the first time in history in 1842, with the workers trying to force the owners to introduce some better conditions, and eventually in the 60s, with the Second Reform Act, there was more representation for working people and better conditions. Some of the specific aspects, like the child employment, was dealt with even earlier. The situation was improving. Of course, it was not improving fast enough, and for many people, including children, initially orphans, but then soon enough, poor parents were forced by the living circumstances to send their children to work to contribute to the family budget. This was a horrible thing, but actually the Victorians were trying to do something with it. Another interesting documentary narrated by Tony Robinson I would say a bit more sensationalist, but quite funny. He's a funny actor, so watch him for this sake. It's called The Worst Jobs in History, and there is one episode about the Victorian world, and he goes through the rather long list of unpleasant and tiresome jobs, including the farm workers, especially children who worked in the farm in completely unregulated conditions. So all those factory acts were only applying to the industry and the industrial workers. The agricultural workers, and especially the poor people, including children, working from their homes in the so-called cottage industries or piecework. So producing things from their own homes. This was completely unregulated, and it was in many cases quite worse than the conditions in the industry. So in The Worst Jobs in History, he talks about the life of people managing the railways and building the railways, the navies. If you remember our discussion of the trains and the development of the technology in Britain, of course, this goes like this. Then he talks about all the poor people living in the country, living in the cities, and especially doing all kinds of small menial jobs, either collecting things, so basically scavenging jobs, or selling things in the street, like, I don't know, selling street food or vegetables or such things. So costermongers and other street sellers. And here comes a very important name to remember, Henry Mayhew. Henry Mayhew was a journalist, a reporter, who interviewed, he was probably the first journalist to ever talk to poor people. He interviewed poor people in London, all kinds of costermongers, so people selling food in the street, selling other things, street cleaners, all those scavengers, very often children, looking for anything of value in the streets or on the banks of the River Thames, sometimes even in the canals for in the sewage system, looking for any scraps of metal or wood or rags or anything. Sometimes they could find, I know, coins or perhaps even pieces of jewelry if they were very lucky. But cigar end collectors in pubs who would collect the dropped ends of cigars that would be later made for cheaper cigars for poor people who couldn't afford new cigars. So all these things, sometimes quite shocking, like collecting dog feces, the dog poo, to sell to the tanning industry, because, well, they didn't have chemicals to process leather, and of course leather was a very important product in Victorian society, and tanneries used things like dog feces, which were collected in the street by those scavenging people of the very, very poor sections of the society. Rat catchers, yes, some people even ate rat meat, but these people from the bottom of the society, and Henry Mayhew talked to them, and he wrote the articles for the press, retelling the lives of the poor people from a very humanist perspective, showing them as humans, showing them as not lazy or criminal or stupid or anything of the stereotypes that were very frequent among the middle class, that were basically afraid of the poor, but showing them as people who try to survive, who are victims of I don't know, poor living conditions, low wages, diseases, the complete lack of any welfare system, of any insurance. So even people from, let's say, relatively well-off background could be thrown into poverty by illness, by the loss of the breadwinner in the family, by an accident. And of course, all these industries and all this work was very dangerous, and accidents happened a lot. So, for example, you could see in a Victorian street, you would see a lot of people without hands or legs, because the state of medical knowledge was such that if you had a complicated fracture of a bone, so if a bone pierced your skin, so there was a risk of contamination of the wound, it was much safer to cut off the limb and save your life. You still had something like 50% chance of surviving, but if the limb was not cut, you had like 90% chance of dying. So lots of people lacked parts of their bodies, they lost them due to accidents, and this could throw them into poverty, this could throw them into destitution even. So Henry Mayhew's articles were collected in a very famous and still important book called London Labour and the London Poor. There are copies of this book in the British Studies Centre if you want to write perhaps your essay about the life of the poor people in London. This is a very good idea. So that was the working life in the industry, and the working life of the street sellers. Another interesting documentary which I found and which you might want to watch is called Children Who Built Victorian Britain, and it's precisely about child labour, largely based on diaries, letters, government reports, autobiographies of these children. So if you want to learn about the life of children who worked in the industries, especially the orphans, the documentary called Children Who Built Victorian Britain is something I would recommend to you. So what we have are the stories of abuse, also sexual abuse, and hard work, sometimes being basically slaving for the masters. A notorious case of child abuse connected to labor is the chimney sweeps. So the young children, especially young boys, sometimes as young as 5, climbing up the chimneys from the fireplaces in Victorian households and cleaning the chimneys of all the soot and the dust provided by the coal, caused by the coal fires. So there were some horrible stories of children suffocating or being stuck in the chimneys. They were not paid for their labor because they were apprentices. It means that the employer was supposed to look after them, feed them, clothe them, educate them, and in return they should work. Of course, this was frequently abused, and there were some regulations against it passed by the government, but not all the regulations were easy to police. So for a long time this actually continued. Another notorious way of abusing children for work was employing small children, boys and girls, in mines. Usually not to dig for coal or to carry heavy loads, but to open and close the doors. And if you ever have a chance of going to Wales, to southern Wales, to the place called Blenavon, there is an old coal mine which has been turned into a museum. You can go down, I've been there, very interesting, although quite sad, especially when they talk about the ways that the children worked there. So small children, usually underdeveloped because they didn't see the light of day, except on Sunday. They would only see the sunlight on Sunday because they started work so early and finished so late. They would sit in complete darkness and open and close the doors in the long corridors for ventilation basically of the coal mines. Whenever somebody was passing, like some miners or a horse-drawn cart, they would just sit there next to the doors and just open and close all day, like 10 hours or longer, without even watching the sun. So of course they were underdeveloped. They were very small, and their health was of course quite poor as well. So another case, boy soldiers and sailors. It was very frequent in the 19th century still to have young children, often orphans, but sometimes they would follow their fathers, to be sailers on ships, all kinds of ships, including the military ships of the Royal Navy, and also in the army. So the boy soldiers are not really the invention of recent times in some, I know, horrible wars in Africa. This happens in the Victorian period as well. But at the same time, the 19th century is the period when childhood is, you might say, discovered by the artists, by the poets, starting with the Romanticism. Childhood is seen as the time of innocence, of special protection, deserving special protection. And this is what starts to be the background for all the campaigning to help the working children, because it was generally assumed that your childhood ended when you started work. So if you started work around 6 or 7, that was the end of your childhood. You had to contribute to the family budget. You had to think in more, let's say, adult terms. So we have the parliamentary acts regulating these things, and we also have compulsory education, which I mentioned last time. And we continue in a moment.